Gather around, my friends. Make yourselves comfortable. Let the silence settle in, and listen closely to my voice. We are about to journey far back in time, to an era where myths walked the earth and men built empires that touched the very clouds. I want to tell you a story about a man who had everything a mortal could possibly desire. A man who possessed unimaginable wealth, absolute power, and the blinding envy of the entire world. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a kingdom named Oakhaven. Oakhaven was not just a city. It was a paradise carved out of the earth. It was a place where the wide, rushing rivers supposedly gleamed with real gold dust under the midday sun. The streets were paved with smooth, white marble, and the air always smelled of roasting meats, sweet jasmine, and expensive spices brought in by merchants from across the oceans. The granaries were always full, the children were always singing, and the palace towers were so incredibly high that they seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. At the very heart of this magnificent empire ruled a man who was larger than life, King Ozymandias. To everyone who saw him, to the farmers, the soldiers, and the foreign kings, Ozymandias was not just a human being. He was a living god. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a voice that could command an army or charm a bird from a tree. He was victorious in every battle he fought. But his wealth and his armies were not what made him famous. No, King Ozymandias was famous across the known world for one staggering, unbelievable fact. He had exactly 101 wives. Imagine the sheer scale of it. 101 queens, hand-picked from the most powerful, noble houses, the most beautiful tribes, and the richest neighboring lands. Whenever the king made a public appearance, the entire city would shut down. Let me paint the picture for you. It is the height of summer. The grand iron gates of the palace swing open. Out steps a procession of 50 white horses, followed by drummers beating a rhythm that you can feel in your chest. And then there he is, King Ozymandias, sitting atop a massive golden carriage pulled by elephants. He is dressed in the finest red silk, a crown of heavy rubies resting upon his brow. As he rides through the streets, the crowds go absolutely wild. People are hanging from their windows, throwing rose petals. "Long live the Lion of Oakhaven," the high priests would shout, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Look upon him, the man blessed by the gods, 101 queens, a titan of vigor and life. Truly, he is the happiest, most powerful man on the face of the earth. The king would stand up in his carriage. He would look out at the thousands of adoring faces. He would wave his heavy, ring-covered hands. He would laugh a booming, hearty laugh that made the people feel safe. He would reach into massive chests of silver coins and throw them generously into the cheering throngs. His face stretched into a magnificent, radiant smile. To the world, he was the picture of absolute perfection. A man who lacked nothing. A man who had conquered the world and conquered love. But my friends, that was a lie. It was the greatest, most tragic lie ever told in the history of the world. The citizens of Oakhaven were completely, entirely wrong. King Ozymandias was not the happiest man alive. He was a man trapped in a living, breathing, inescapable nightmare. The grand illusion only lasted as long as the sun was in the sky. When the parades ended, when the carriage returned to the palace, and when the heavy, iron-wrought doors of the royal quarters were finally pulled shut and locked from the inside, the king's brilliant smile would vanish instantly. The moment he was alone in the quiet shadows of his hallway, the great lion of Oakhaven would not stand tall. His shoulders would slump. His breathing would become ragged and heavy. He would lean against the cold stone walls, closing his eyes in sheer, overwhelming terror. Because as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the kingdom, the king knew what awaited him. Nightfall was coming. And with nightfall came his duties to the 101 queens, who waited in the grand pavilion, a duty that was slowly, painfully, tearing his body and his soul apart. Let us step away from the cheering crowds and the sunlit streets of Oakhaven. Imagine the sun slowly dipping below the horizon. The sky turns into shades of deep purple and blood red. For the farmers in the fields and the merchants in the markets, the setting of the sun is a blessing. It means the day's hard labor is done. It means a warm fire, a bowl of stew, and the comforting embrace of sleep. But for King Ozymandias, the setting sun was the most terrifying sight in the world. As twilight crept through the massive arched windows of the royal palace, a heavy, suffocating silence would fall over the king's private chambers. The golden armor was removed by his servants. The heavy, jewel-encrusted crowns were locked away in iron chests. And once the servants bowed and left him alone, the great, invincible lion of Oakhaven would collapse into a velvet armchair, trembling like a frightened child. He was not preparing for rest. He was preparing for a battlefield where no swords were drawn, but where his life was being drained away, drop by drop. To understand the sheer horror of the king's existence, my friends, you must understand the mathematics of his torment. I want you to think about this carefully. 101 wives. These were not ordinary women. They were princesses from fiercely proud tribes, daughters of dangerous warlords, and heirs to vast neighboring empires. Their families had given them to King Ozymandias to secure peace, wealth, and power. And in return, the absolute, unbending rule of the kingdom was that the king had to prove his dominance, his love, and his godlike virility to every single one of them. To maintain the delicate political balance of his empire, a schedule had been devised by the High Council, a schedule so cruel, so relentlessly punishing, that it defied human biology. Every single night, as the grandfather clocks in the palace chimed the 8th hour, the chief eunuch would enter the king's study. He would carry a long silk scroll. Written on this scroll in golden ink were 10 names, 10 queens. Every night, King Ozymandias was legally and politically obligated to visit 10 different bedchambers. Imagine the sheer, impossible weight of that duty. There were no days off. There were no holidays to rest. If a storm raged outside, he had to go. If he was shivering with a winter fever, he had to go. If his bones ached and his mind was clouded with absolute exhaustion, he still had to walk down that grand, endless hallway. 10 wives a night, without fail. If he missed a single chamber, the rumors would begin by morning. The queen who was skipped would write to her father. Her father, a powerful warlord or neighboring king, would feel insulted. Trade routes would be threatened. Armies would begin to gather at the borders. The entire peace of the continent balanced precariously on the king's ability to perform. He was not a husband. He was a political instrument, a machine made of flesh and bone, driven to the absolute brink of destruction. By his 40th year, Ozymandias felt like a man of 80. The public saw his padded clothing and painted face. But beneath the silk robes, his body was a ruin. His muscles constantly burned with a fiery ache. His spine throbbed from the sheer physical labor of his nights. He suffered from severe chronic insomnia. His body was so overworked, so constantly flooded with anxiety, that even when he had a few hours to sleep during the day, he would just stare at the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs in a terrifying, irregular rhythm. The pavilion of the 101, the massive wing of the palace where the queens lived, smelled of heavy incense, crushed jasmine, and expensive musk. To anyone else, it was the scent of paradise. To the king, it was the smell of a beautiful, gilded slaughterhouse. Every night, he would stand at the entrance of the pavilion, staring down the seemingly endless corridor lined with heavy oak doors. Behind each door waited a woman who expected the passion of a legendary lover. Behind each door waited expectations he could no longer meet. He would take a deep, shaky breath, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He would force his lips to curve upwards into that famous, charming smile. And then, fighting the absolute dread twisting in his stomach, the king would take his first step into the corridor, knowing deep in his heart that he was marching, night after night, slowly but surely, toward his own grave. Now, my friends, let us turn our gaze away from the trembling king. Let us walk down that endless, softly lit corridor. Let us step inside the pavilion of the 101. To the outside world, this wing of the palace was a garden of earthly delights. It was a sprawling maze of indoor courtyards, marble baths filled with warm rosewater, and walls draped in the finest, shimmering silks from the Orient. Peacocks roamed freely through the gardens, and the air was always filled with the soft, melodic strumming of golden harps. But beautiful cages are still cages. You see, it is easy to pity the king. It is easy to look at his exhausting burden and see him as the sole victim of this grand tragedy. But the truth of Oakhaven is far more complicated and far more heartbreaking. The queens were not monsters. They were not cruel, heartless women intentionally trying to kill their husband. They were simply prisoners of the exact same mathematics. Let us do the math once more, but this time from their side of the heavy oak doors. 101 wives. The king visits 10 a night. That meant every single queen, after her brief night with the king, had to wait 10 long, agonizing days before she would see him again. Imagine being a princess. Imagine growing up in a powerful, noble house where you were the center of the universe, adored and pampered by everyone around you. Then you are married off to the greatest king in the world, only to realize you are just one of 101. You are given a massive room, expensive jewelry, and a small army of servants. But the one thing you actually crave, the affection and validation of your husband, is rationed out to you like drops of water to a dying person in the desert. What does a woman do for those 10 days of waiting? For the queens of Oakhaven, those 10 days were a slow burning torture of the mind. On the first day after the king's visit, a queen might feel satisfied and happy. But by the 4th day, the silence of her massive chamber would begin to echo. By the 7th day, jealousy would start to creep under the door like a dark, suffocating fog. And by the 9th day, she was consumed by a toxic, fiery bitterness. Every night, while a queen lay alone in her cold bed, she would listen. Through the thick walls, she could hear the soft footsteps of the king walking down the hall. She would hear the heavy doors opening and closing. She knew exactly which of her rivals the king was visiting. "Is he spending more time in Queen Isolde's chamber than he did in mine?" they would whisper to their handmaidens in the dark. Why did I hear him laughing with Queen Seraphina? He did not laugh when he was with me. The pavilion became a viper's nest of rumors, whispers, and rivalries. The queens formed bitter factions. They spied on one another relentlessly. If the king gifted a ruby necklace to a queen from the north, the queens from the south would be thrown into a blind rage, demanding emeralds and diamonds the very next time the king visited them. They were like beautiful exotic birds locked in a single massive cage, pecking at each other out of sheer boredom and desperate insecurity. They measured their entire self-worth, their beauty, and their political power by how much passion the king showed them on that one single night out of 10. And so, when the 10th night finally arrived, when the heavy door to a queen's chamber finally groaned open and King Ozymandias stepped inside, the expectations in the room were impossibly high. The queen waiting for him did not see a tired, broken man. She did not see the dark circles under his eyes, heavily covered by the court painters, or notice the slight tremble in his sweat-slicked hands. She only saw a husband who had neglected her for 10 days. And because she had waited so long, she demanded absolute perfection. She demanded a lover who was vibrant, energetic, and overwhelmingly passionate. She would weep, she would argue, she would pull at his heavy robes, demanding to know if he loved her more than the others. She needed to extract 10 days' worth of affection, validation, and physical energy out of a single, fleeting hour. They demanded the fire of a dragon, from a man who was nothing more than a pile of dying embers. It was a vicious, unbreakable cycle of absolute misery. The more the queens waited, the more fiercely demanding they became. And the more demanding they became, the faster they drained the life out of the man they were all fighting over. They were all trapped. The king crushing under the physical weight of his duty. And the queens suffocating under the emotional starvation of their golden cage. Together, in the dark of the night, they were slowly destroying one another, all while the kingdom outside slept soundly, dreaming of their perfect, happy rulers. How does a man survive the impossible? How does a king, broken in body and spirit, find the strength to walk into the fire every single night? The answer, my friends, was not hidden in the prayers of the priests, nor in the rich food of the royal kitchens. The answer was hidden deep in the lowest, darkest cellars of the palace, where the sun never reached. This was the domain of Meister Linus, the chief royal apothecary. To the public, Meister Linus was a wise old healer who made sweet syrups for coughing children. But to King Ozymandias, he was the keeper of the kingdom's darkest secret. He was the dark alchemist who kept the puppet king moving when his strings were ready to snap. Every afternoon, as the dread of the approaching sunset began to tighten around the king's throat, a heavy knock would echo in his private study. The door would creak open, and Meister Linus would step inside, his face pale and expressionless. In his hands, he carried an elaborate silver tray covered with glass vials and stone bowls. The smell of the room would immediately change. It went from the scent of fresh roses to something bitter, earthy, and metallic. It smelled like venom. "Your medicine, my liege?" the apothecary would whisper, bowing low. The king would stare at the tray with absolute hatred. These potions were the only things keeping him alive, yet they were destroying him from the inside out. First came the crimson draught. It was a thick, boiling liquid made from the crushed venom sacs of desert scorpions, mixed with rare mountain ginseng. The king would hold his breath, tilt his head back, and swallow the vile substance. Almost immediately, a violent shudder would tear through his body. The poison forced his heart to beat faster, artificially elevating his blood pressure, tricking his exhausted muscles into feeling a sudden, terrifying rush of adrenaline. But adrenaline alone could not kill the pain. Next came the black powder. Maester Linus would grind the horn of a northern beast with fermented nightshade, a deadly poison in large doses. The apothecary would mix it into a cup of bitter wine. The king would drink it down, and within minutes, the excruciating aches in his spine and joints would go numb. He couldn't feel his legs properly. He felt as though he were floating, completely disconnected from his own flesh. And finally, the wakeful root. A hard, foul-tasting root that the king kept in a small pouch on his belt. Between visiting each of the 10 queens, when his vision blurred and he felt he might pass out in the hallway, he would chew on this root. It tasted of ash and copper, but it sent a sharp, agonizing jolt through his nervous system, keeping his eyes wide open. This was the terrifying reality of the happiest man on earth. He was not fueled by passion or love. He was a beast of burden, whipped and beaten into motion by chemical fires and black magic. The potions took a horrific toll. The king began to suffer terrifying hallucinations in the middle of the day. His hands shook so violently that he could no longer hold a goblet of wine without spilling it. His servants had to invent excuses for why they fed him. His teeth began to loosen from chewing the wakeful root, and his stomach was a permanent knot of ulcers and bleeding pain. Maester Linus knew he was slowly killing his king. The apothecary had warned Ozymandias time and time again. "My lord," Linus had begged one rainy afternoon, watching the king cough up black bile. The human heart is a muscle, not a machine. If we continue the crimson draught, your heart will eventually burst. The king had simply wiped his mouth with a silk handkerchief, his eyes bloodshot and empty. "If I stop, Linus, I lose the queens," the king replied, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "If I lose the queens, I lose the crown. If I lose the crown, I am nothing. Prepare the potions." And so, the dark alchemy continued. Night after night, the apothecary brewed the poison. Night after night, the king drank his death. He painted over his pale, sickly skin with heavy rouge, strapped on his padded golden armor, and marched out to meet his 101 wives, a walking corpse disguised as a living god. There is a breaking point for every man, even for a king forged in the fires of battle. There is a moment when the knees buckle, and the spirit simply shatters. For King Ozymandias, that moment arrived on a cold, rainy evening in the late autumn of his 49th year. The rain was lashing against the thick glass windows of his private study. Inside, the fire was roaring in the hearth, but the king was shivering violently. He had just finished coughing, a wet, rattling sound that left drops of blood on his white silk handkerchief. He looked at his reflection in the polished silver of a wine jug. He saw a ghost, a hollow, greying, dying man staring back at him. The terror of the impending night washed over him. The thought of swallowing the burning scorpion venom, the thought of walking down that endless corridor of the pavilion, the thought of forcing a smile while his bones screamed in agony. It was suddenly too much. He could not take one more step. With trembling hands, the king rang the heavy brass bell on his desk. Within moments, the heavy oak doors opened. In walked Lord Vane, the Grand Chancellor of Oakhaven. Vane was a shrewd, calculating man, dressed in dark velvet. He was the architect of the kingdom's politics, the man who balanced the ledgers and maintained the alliances. "You summoned me, my liege?" Lord Vane asked, bowing deeply. The king did not sit tall in his chair. Instead, he slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. When he spoke, it was not the booming, commanding voice of the Lion of Oakhaven. It was the desperate, weeping whisper of a broken prisoner. "I cannot go on, Vane," the king sobbed, tears slipping through his fingers and falling onto the heavy mahogany desk. "I am dying. The potions are eating my insides. The nights are killing my heart. I cannot do it anymore." Lord Vane froze. The sight of the legendary king crying like a child was deeply unnerving. He stepped closer, his voice hushed. "My king, what are you saying?" Ozymandias looked up, his bloodshot eyes pleading. "I want to be free. Let the scribes draft the decrees of separation tonight. We will be generous. Give them gold. Give them lands. Give them 100 servants each. I will keep Queen Ilara, and perhaps Queen Isolde. But the rest, send the other 99 back to their fathers. I just want to sleep, Vane. I just want to live." For a long, terrifying moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the rain beating against the glass. Lord Vane's face turned the color of ash. He did not offer comfort. He did not rush to follow the king's orders. Instead, he fell to his knees, his voice trembling, not with pity, but with absolute panic. "My king, you cannot. I beg of you, take back those words. If you do this, it will be the absolute ruin of Oakhaven." The king wiped his eyes, a spark of anger cutting through his despair. "I am the king. I have secured the wealth of this nation. Have I not earned the right to rest in my own home?" "You are the king," Vane replied, his voice hardening into a cold, sharp blade. "And that is exactly why you do not have the luxury of a private life. Think, my liege. Think of the trap we have built." The Chancellor stood up and walked to the map of the continent hanging on the wall. He pointed to the borders. "If you divorce 99 queens, what do you think the world will say tomorrow morning? Will they say you are tired? No. They will say the lion has lost his teeth. The taverns will erupt with laughter. The bards will sing mocking songs about how the great king's manhood finally failed him. You will become a joke, my lord." Ozymandias flinched as if he had been physically struck. His pride was his most precious possession. "But it is worse than mockery," Vane continued, stepping closer to the desk, his eyes burning with political terror. "These women are the daughters of warlords, tribal chiefs, and rival emperors. If you return them, you insult their bloodlines. The southern tribes will block the spice trade. The northern lords will refuse to send their soldiers to our army. It will spark a civil war that will burn this city to the ground." The Chancellor leaned over the desk, his face inches from the king's. "And when the neighboring empires hear that our kingdom is divided, and that our king is a weak, impotent old man, they will cross the borders. They will burn your fields. They will slaughter your people. Your legacy will not be the glorious Lion of Oakhaven. You will be remembered in history as the weak fool who lost his empire because he could not handle his own wives. The words struck the king like heavy iron hammers. The brutal, inescapable truth hung in the air, suffocating him. He was trapped, not by the queens, not by the potions. He was trapped by his own colossal myth. He had allowed the world to believe he was a god of endless vitality, and now the entire survival of his empire depended on maintaining that impossible lie. To break the illusion meant death for his kingdom. To maintain it meant death for himself. King Ozymandias slowly leaned back in his chair. The spark of rebellion in his eyes died out, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a condemned man. He looked at his own golden crown resting on the table, seeing it for what it truly was, a beautiful, heavy shackle. "I understand," the king whispered. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "My liege," Vane started softly, a hint of guilt finally touching his voice. "Leave me, Vane," the king commanded quietly, "and send word to Maester Linus. Tell him I will need a double dose of the Crimson Draught tonight." Lord Vane bowed his head, knowing he had just sealed his sovereign's death warrant to save the realm. He backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors. Alone once more, the king did not cry. He simply sat in the quiet, watching the rain, waiting for the dark alchemist to arrive with his poison. He had accepted his fate. He would die in the golden cage, crushed by the very pride that had built it. The universe, my friends, has a very cruel sense of irony. Just as King Ozymandias was reaching the absolute limits of his physical endurance, his 50th birthday arrived. And in the kingdom of Oakhaven, the 50th birthday of a reigning monarch was not just a passing day. It was the event of a lifetime. Lord Vane and the High Council announced the Grand Jubilee. For an entire month, the kingdom would celebrate. Imagine the sheer scale of it. Every street was draped in crimson and gold banners. Fountains in the city squares ran with sweet wine instead of water. By day, there were massive parades with fire breathers, acrobats, and dancers from across the sea. By night, the sky was set ablaze with blinding, colorful fireworks that shook the very foundations of the city. The people were ecstatic. They sang songs of their great king, praising the gods for giving them a ruler of such immense joy, health, and vitality. But imagine the sheer, unspeakable horror of this for King Ozymandias. For 30 days, he was required to be completely visible. During the daylight hours, he was forced to sit atop a massive golden elephant under the sweltering sun, waving to the crowds, wearing 30 pounds of golden armor, and feasting on heavy, rich meats at public banquets. But the daylight was only half the torture. Inside the pavilion of the 101, the Jubilee had created a terrifying fever pitch of excitement. The queens, emboldened by the festival atmosphere, expected their husband to be in a particularly joyous and passionate mood. To them, it was a month of celebration. They wore their finest perfumes, their most revealing silks, and they expected the legendary Lion of Oakhaven to roar louder than ever before. 10 queens a night. And now they demanded the energy of a young warrior celebrating his greatest victory. The king was not surviving. He was rapidly disintegrating. By the 7th day of the Jubilee, he had lost so much weight that his servants had to wrap layers of thick linen around his waist and arms beneath his robes. just so he wouldn't look like a walking skeleton. By the 10th day, his hair began to fall out in clumps. The court painters spent hours every evening applying heavy, lead-based white paint and dark rouge to his face, just to hide the terrifying grey colour of a man whose organs were failing. By the 14th day, the king could barely feel his left arm. It was constantly numb, tingling with a dull, throbbing pain. A permanent, crushing weight had settled on his chest, as if an invisible demon was sitting on his lungs. He was surviving purely on the dark alchemy of Meister Linus. He was drinking double doses of the crimson draught just to stand up, and chewing the bitter wakeful root until his gums bled. He was a mechanical puppet, his strings pulled so tightly that they were beginning to fray and snap. And then came the 15th night of the Jubilee, the midway point of the festival. A massive thunderstorm had rolled over the kingdom. Outside, the rain lashed heavily against the palace, and thunder roared, matching the sound of the Jubilee fireworks. The air inside the king's chambers was thick, hot, and suffocating. King Ozymandias stood before his full-length silver mirror. The painters had finished their work. His face looked vibrant, but his eyes were completely bloodshot, sunken deep into dark, hollow sockets. They were the eyes of a dead man. Meister Linus stood in the shadows, his hands shaking as he held the silver tray. He knew the king's heart was beating in a chaotic, terrifying rhythm. He knew that what he was about to give him was a death sentence. The king did not look at him. He simply reached out, took 3 separate vials of the black, venomous potions, and drank them down, one after another. A violent spasm ripped through his body. He gripped the edges of the dressing table to stop himself from collapsing. The poison surged through his veins, forcing his dying heart into a frantic, galloping sprint. The king let out a ragged, wet breath. He pulled his heavy velvet robes tightly around his shoulders. He turned away from the mirror, ignoring the apothecary's quiet weeping. He opened his bedroom door. He stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, and King Ozymandias began his final march toward the pavilion of the 101. The air inside the pavilion of the 101 was thick. It smelled suffocatingly sweet, a heavy mixture of burning frankincense, crushed rose petals, and warm musk. But tonight, beneath that sweet perfume, the king could only smell his own impending death. Outside, the thunder crashed, rattling the stained glass windows. But inside the king's chest, a different kind of storm was raging. The triple dose of the crimson draught was tearing through his bloodstream. Within moments, the heavy oak doors opened. In walked Lord Vane, the Grand Chancellor of Oakhaven. Vane was a shrewd, calculating man, dressed in dark velvet. He was the architect of the kingdom's politics, the man who balanced the ledgers and maintained the alliances. "You summoned me, my liege?" Lord Vane asked, bowing deeply. The king did not sit tall in his chair. Instead, he slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. When he spoke, it was not the booming, commanding voice of the Lion of Oakhaven. It was the desperate, weeping whisper of a broken prisoner. "I cannot go on, Vane," the king sobbed, tears slipping through his fingers and falling onto the heavy mahogany desk. "I am dying. The potions are eating my insides. The nights are killing my heart. I cannot do it anymore." Lord Vane froze. The sight of the legendary king crying like a child was deeply unnerving. He stepped closer, his voice hushed. "My king, what are you saying?" Ozymandias looked up. his bloodshot eyes pleading. I want to be free. Let the scribes draft the decrees of separation tonight. We will be generous. Give them gold. Give them lands. Give them 100 servants each. I will keep Queen Ilara, and perhaps Queen Isolde. But the rest, send the other 99 back to their fathers. I just want to sleep, Vane. I just want to live. For a long, terrifying moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the rain beating against the glass. Lord Vane's face turned the color of ash. He did not offer comfort. He did not rush to follow the king's orders. Instead, he fell to his knees, his voice trembling, not with pity, but with absolute panic. My king, you cannot. I beg of you, take back those words. If you do this, it will be the absolute ruin of Oakhaven. The king wiped his eyes, a spark of anger cutting through his despair. I am the king. I have secured the wealth of this nation. Have I not earned the right to rest in my own home? You are the king, Vane replied, his voice hardening into a cold, sharp blade. And that is exactly why you do not have the luxury of a private life. Think, my liege. Think of the trap we have built. The Chancellor stood up and walked to the map of the continent hanging on the wall. He pointed to the borders. If you divorce 99 queens, what do you think the world will say tomorrow morning? Will they say you are tired? No. They will say the lion has lost his teeth. The taverns will erupt with laughter. The bards will sing mocking songs about how the great king's manhood finally failed him. You will become a joke, my lord. Ozymandias flinched as if he had been physically struck. His pride was his most precious possession. But it is worse than mockery, Vane continued, stepping closer to the desk, his eyes burning with political terror. These women are the daughters of warlords, tribal chiefs, and rival emperors. If you return them, you insult their bloodlines. The southern tribes will block the spice trade. The northern lords will refuse to send their soldiers to our army. It will spark a civil war that will burn this city to the ground. The Chancellor leaned over the desk, his face inches from the king's. And when the neighboring empires hear that our kingdom is divided, and that our king is a weak, impotent old man, they will cross the borders. They will burn your fields. They will slaughter your people. Your legacy will not be the glorious Lion of Oakhaven. You will be remembered in history as the weak fool who lost his empire because he could not handle his own wives. The words struck the king like heavy iron hammers. The brutal, inescapable truth hung in the air, suffocating him. He was trapped, not by the queens, not by the potions. He was trapped by his own colossal myth. He had allowed the world to believe he was a god of endless vitality, and now the entire survival of his empire depended on maintaining that impossible lie. To break the illusion meant death for his kingdom. To maintain it meant death for himself. King Ozymandias slowly leaned back in his chair. The spark of rebellion in his eyes died out, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a condemned man. He looked at his own golden crown resting on the table, seeing it for what it truly was, a beautiful, heavy shackle. I understand, the king whispered. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. My liege, Vane started softly, a hint of guilt finally touching his voice. Leave me, Vane, the king commanded quietly, and send word to Maester Linus. Tell him I will need a double dose of the Crimson Draught tonight. Lord Vane bowed his head, knowing he had just sealed his sovereign's death warrant to save the realm. He backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors. Queen Elara shrieked. It was a piercing, terrifying sound of absolute horror that shattered the quiet of the pavilion. The sound echoed down the massive corridors of the harem, halting the music and the laughter of the queens waiting in the other rooms. Guards rushed in, their swords drawn, followed shortly by the panicked, pale figure of Maester Linus, the apothecary. They gathered around the fallen monarch. The heavy makeup had smeared across the floor, revealing the ghostly grey skin beneath. Maester Linus fell to his knees. He placed a trembling ear against the king's chest, but he met only utter, terrifying silence. The greatest machine in Oakhaven had shattered. King Ozymandias was dead. The kingdom of Oakhaven was plunged into a period of mourning, the likes of which the world had never seen. When the sun rose the next morning, the Jubilee banners were torn down, replaced by black flags. The skies themselves seemed to weep, raining continuously for a week. Thousands of citizens wailed openly in the streets, tearing their clothes, mourning the passing of their perfect ruler. But inside the palace, Lord Vane and the High Council moved quickly to protect the illusion. They could never let the world know the truth. They could never admit that their king had died of sheer, miserable exhaustion in the bedchamber of his fifth wife of the night. It would destroy the empire. And so, Lord Vane drafted the official decree. He told the kingdom and the world that the gods had looked down upon Oakhaven. He said that the gods were so jealous of the king's boundless joy, his immense vitality, and his perfect happiness, that they had struck him down with a bolt of divine, invisible lightning to bring him up to the heavens. They buried King Ozymandias in a mausoleum of solid gold. Around the capital city, master sculptors were commissioned to erect colossal statues of him. They carved him out of flawless white marble, depicting him with bulging muscles, a fierce, confident gaze, and that legendary, radiant smile. For centuries to come, bards would sing of the Lion of Oakhaven. Young men would pray at his statues for a fraction of his strength, and kings across the world would envy his glorious legacy. He went down in the history books as the happiest, most deeply satisfied man to ever walk the earth. But you and I know the truth. None of those worshipping crowds ever knew that beneath the gold, beneath the glory, and beneath the smile, the king died a miserable, exhausted prisoner. He was a man crushed to death by the weight of 101 women, destroyed by the dark magic he used to survive them, and locked forever inside a beautiful golden cage, built by his own unbreakable pride.